We've covered a lot of poison types in these guides. For some reason, Kanto has a lot of them. Possibly due to the early industrialization of the region? I'm not sure. But the poison types have ranged from things like Bulbasaur, where the poison typing barely came into consideration, to Butterfree and Venomoth, where, yeah, they gave off poisonous scales as they moved, but it wasn't really their fault. All the way to Beedrill, who will actively try to inject you with venom. Not great, but manageable. After all, it's not like any of their very presences poison the ground and make the air smell so bad that it's hard to be near them, unlike some Pokemon I'm about to name drop. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we figure out how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be going over the stinky, smelly, toxic sludge Pokemon Grimer and its evolution Muck. And that description was not just me hating on the Pokemon, that's actually what it is. Grimer's body is composed of a mixture of sludge, toxins, waste, and multiple large bacterial colonies. To that end, its body is very amorphous and changing, but generally they will have a body that looks like a pile of sludge with 2 arms, each with 3 fingers on the end, 2 eyes, and a mouth. It also stands an average of about 3 feet tall and weighs just over 66 pounds. And size is important. It's one of the main ways that you can tell Grimer from its evolution Muck. Muck tends to come in at almost 4 feet tall, but still weighing the same as its pre-evolution, which seems to suggest that Muck's body is composed of a lot less dense material. That, or there's a glitch in the Pokedex systems that's just reading it wrong. Either way, the only way to really tell the difference between a Muck and a Grimer is size. Muck's arms are longer, its mouth is bigger, and it's just a bigger pile of sludge overall. Also, the toxins and bacteria that make up Muck's body are much, much stronger, leading to an even worse smell that could burn your nose hairs out. Which I'm sure makes a lot of you wonder, why would anyone want this Pokemon as a pet? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. So, if any of this sounds interesting to you, then let's get into the guide and figure out if these guys could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. Considering the fact that these guys are just piles of toxic sludge, it would be much more apt to call this section of the guide Containment rather than Enclosure. Because that's exactly what we're going to be doing, containing these guys. Thanks to the toxic nature of their bodies, you do not want them getting out or wandering around your yard, or Arceus forbid, your house. Your property will end up becoming a biohazard zone while the Pokemon get cleaned up. So, when talking about the size for the enclosure, something you have to think about is that while these Pokemon do move around, they aren't fast. I mean, they don't even have legs. So the enclosure should be large enough for them to move around a bit, but not terribly large. Unfortunately, these Pokemon aren't really kept in small single Pokemon enclosures the way we're talking about in these guides. It's usually more in a large enclosure containing hundreds of them that is used for industrial waste. Meaning that dimensions for single enclosures aren't really standardized across the board. So, judging by the few individual owners I've spoken to and extrapolating from the sizes of the industrial enclosures, you should be looking for something rectangular, with one side being at least 30 feet long and the other being 10 feet long. When it comes to height, I would make it just taller than the height of an average Muck, meaning about 4.5 feet tall to about 5 feet tall. This should provide plenty of room for your Pokemon to move about without taking up too much room wherever you put the enclosure. The material that the enclosure is made of is going to be incredibly important. You don't want it breaking down at all, so you're looking for things like very thick glass or super strong plastic. Things that the sludge this Pokemon leaves behind won't eat into, and what can be easily cleaned, which will be important later. You'll also want metal braces to brace the edges of the glass, because the sealant that they usually use to keep these glass enclosures together is something that will get eaten away by the bacteria in Grimer's and Muck's bodies. On one of the sides, you can choose where, you'll also want to install a door in the enclosure that you can use to get into the space. It's very important that you make sure this door seals tight, and I mean airtight. line the door with a rubber gasket. That way when you close and lock it, you are sure that nothing is going to leak out. This door is only for you to put the Pokemon in its Pokeball and to clean the inside of the enclosure. The rest of this time, this door should remain sealed and locked. The last aspect of the enclosure that we should cover is the feeding tube. This is a tube that's made of the same material that you use for the rest of the enclosure, about 1.5 feet in length and about 5 inches in diameter, placed on the top of the enclosure. The top of the tube should have a cap on it. Don't make this one airtight, as this is going to be how the air is going to enter and exit the enclosure. This tube is also going to be how you feed the Pokemon, dropping the food down from the tube into the enclosure. It may seem a bit strange to just dump the food into the enclosure through a tube. After all, we usually have you using food as a training technique or just giving it to them in a bowl, but trust me, you are not going to want to put your hands anywhere near these guys. Also, this is a minor thing, but you should also keep these guys out of the cold and extreme heat. It's weird because they aren't weak to those types, because they're a poison type, but their bodies aren't really well built for those environments. Their bodies mainly rely on being wet, slimy, bacteria-filled blobs, and the cold could cause their bodies to start to freeze and harden, and the bacteria could become dormant. Essentially, they could just freeze in place. And then the heat is worse for them, as it could cause them to dry out and the bacteria in their bodies to get destroyed in the heat. At least with the cold, you could always defrost them. If your Grimer or Muck gets exposed to too much heat, then it'll be a long recovery process of adding in more hydration and new bacterial cultures. So if you live in an area of the world where the temperature can get into the freezing or boiling ranges, then you may want to reconsider these Pokemon. Oh, and you will be keeping these Pokemon outside, unless you want your house to smell so bad that you'll never have guests over again. For the Pokemon that can be housed with them, I don't know what to tell you besides that nothing's really going to survive being in this enclosed space with a Grimer evolution, aside from other Grimer evolutions. I suppose some of the less organic steel types like the Magnemite or Clinklines could, because steel types are naturally very resistant to toxins, and their inorganic biology means that they don't really have a way to ingest the toxins given off by the Grimer evolution. But I'd still be worried about the composition of the slime from Grimer leading to corrosion in their bodies. Luckily, these Pokemon can be very social with their own kind. They can oftentimes be found in large swarms, mostly because of what they eat and how they actually reproduce. Which does bring me to a point. These Pokemon do not need another partner Pokemon to make another Grimer. Sure, they can, but there are also documented cases of Grimer reproducing through... I'm not very sure what the process is called, actually. Essentially, as we've discussed, Grimer and Muck's bodies are piles of bacterial colonies suspended in toxic sludge that have begun to work together to form one cohesive sentient being. These bacteria reproduce and grow, and that's how, despite leaving a slime trail everywhere they go, Grimer and Muck don't shrink. But that slime trail still has some of their bacteria in it. If the Grimer and Muck go over the same spot enough times, depositing more bacteria and more sludge each time they do, or if the bacteria in the slime trail is given enough food and time so that it can grow, a new Grimer will just grow out of the slime trail. These Pokemon can essentially just spawn themselves. This is how you can end up with a sudden explosion of them in places like sewers or factory runoffs. And that's also how you might end up with more than one of these Pokemon in your enclosure, despite the fact that you only ever caught or bought one. Which is why cleaning is so important if you don't want a ton of these guys. Thankfully, they all get along with one another, so getting another one by accident isn't a big deal, but this is absolutely something that you have to keep an eye on if you plan on keeping these Pokemon. One Grimer can reproduce this way slowly, but the more you add in, the faster this is going to happen. So just be aware that their population explodes exponentially along with their food source. Availability. Before we sink into this section, I think this would be a good spot to mention that you absolutely need a license to have these guys. I mean, they're considered a hazardous material in and of themselves. So you will have to take a test to make sure you understand the dangers and risks of having these guys around. Your home and enclosure will also need to be inspected to make sure they won't escape and that you have the materials and medicines needed to handle the situation should they escape. It will be a process, and if you want to have one of these guys, then you will legally have to go through it all. So, I know my description just now of how Grimer spawned new Grimer made it seem like there are a ton of these guys everywhere and they're easy to find. And back in the day, that would have been the case. But these days, people are looking more into clean energy, like from the Valley Windworks here in Sinnoh. That swap to clean energy, as good as it is for the environment, means that there's less and less waste product for these guys to feed on. Nowadays, they're often confined to small populations in specific places around the world. Kanto, I think, has the largest population of these guys, with them living in the abandoned Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, around the cycling road between Celadon and Fuchsia City, and they used to live in the old power plant, though I don't think that's the case since they fixed it up. They also live in the Fiery Path in Hoenn, feeding on the toxic fumes from the cooling lava. As well, there's a rather sizable population in the Castelia City sewers in Unova, and a few spots in Paldea, mostly surrounding the cities of Cortando, Levincia, and Porto Marinata. Again, that's really not a lot of spots, and the only natural one is in Hoenn. The rest of them are there because of humans. Well, I guess I should say that they're rarely found in Sinnoh along Route 212, but they're so rare there that I don't know whether I should count it or not. And Alola has their own version of the Grimer line that we'll talk about later in their own guide. But in Kalos, Johto, and Galar, they don't have native populations. Which makes sense for Johto, it's always been more rustic, but both Kalos and Galar have major cities in them. You'd think they'd have Grimer somewhere, but I suppose they got smart about their waste, so there's no food for them. You would also think that, with how easy it is to have them multiply, there would be an amazing amount in the breeding industry, but no. Because of the smell and the toxic nature of their body and food, these guys are not a very popular pet at all. Most people think of these guys as disgusting natural disasters, akin to an oil spill. There aren't many people out there that would raise and sell these guys. In fact, there's such a small pool of people that raise and sell them that you might have a lot of trouble finding them. I know I couldn't find one for my research in this guide, but I'm certain that if you're really determined to find somebody, you might be able to find someone who has a colony of Grimers or Muck. They might not be a professional breeder, just a very odd collector, but they might be able to give you one for a probably significant sum of money. Catchability. I really don't recommend you go out and catch these guys on your own. They tend to live in dangerous, hazardous places that are sometimes illegal for you to enter. Like, the Pokemon Mansion is private land and a dangerous place to walk around. The Castelia sewers are only to be accessed by authorized personnel, and the Fiery Path is a place of extreme heat and poisonous lava fumes. The safest place is maybe in Kanto along the cycling road, or in Paldea, but even then, these Pokemon are so toxic that if they even manage to touch you, you're going to need a hospital. There is no question about that. Unless you are trained in handling Pokemon like this, you should not be going out after them in the wild. But if you're ignoring my warnings, then be sure to bring a Pokemon that won't be affected too terribly by Grimer and Muck. A Steel type, and preferably a Magnemite or Klink evolution. It'll offer you the best chance of both you and your Pokemon coming out of it in good shape. Oh, and when you go after these Pokemon, be aware of your surroundings. Like I said, these Pokemon multiply quickly, and while they aren't as social with each other to the same degree as Pokemon like Seal, they will quickly form large colonies wherever they have food. So be sure that there isn't a couple coming up behind you while you're battling the one you're trying to catch. As for what kind of balls to use when catching them, I'd say a Pokeball or a Great Ball would be good for Grimer, and then an Ultra Ball for Muck. Or an Ultra Ball across the board so you can catch it as quickly as possible and get away from the stench. Care. I need to make this very clear. You will not be interacting with these Pokemon under any circumstances. These Pokemon have the ability to hospitalize you with just a touch. I mean it. One skin to ooze exposure, and you go to the hospital. And it's even worse for Muck. Piggybacking off of that idea, there will also be no training with these Pokemon. These will be very similar to the Ekans line. You will be placing them in their enclosure, and the only time you will do anything besides watch and feed them is when you're cleaning them. This is the most important part of having these Pokemon. They will certainly drill this point home during your attempts to get a dangerous Pokemon handler permit, but I want to make sure you understand it now. These are not cuddling Pokemon. Okay, now that we all understand not to stick your hands in the enclosure, let's talk about food. These Pokemon eat filth. Anything that you look at and think that it could be a health hazard or environmental hazard is probably good for these guys. I mean, they've been known to make homes in sewers because the wastewater is delicious to them. Don't worry though, I'm not going to have you making and feeding Pokemon your very own homemade wastewater. That is a step too far even for me. However, they also really like to feed off of industrial waste and common trash. So here's what we're going to do. First thing you need is a container where you can make Grimer's food. This container needs to be leak-proof and sealable, as your main concern with it is going to be making sure that this toxic mixture doesn't leak into your surroundings. My best recommendation is to get one of those 50-gallon metal barrels that they use to ship oil and auto grease in. They're often rated to hold this kind of stuff, and it takes them years and years to start breaking down. You will have to replace it eventually, but it'll last for quite some time. Plus, the rust that starts to develop inside the barrel will just be better for the food. Take that barrel and fill it 3/4 of the way with water, and then just start dumping stuff into it. And I mean things like industrial grease, old oil from cars or machinery, garbage, even a few drops of gasoline or diesel fuel. If you think of it and your mind goes, that would pollute any water it gets into, then it's a good thing to throw into your Grimer's food. I will say it's best to avoid solid objects that won't get broken down or dissolved in the water. I'm talking things like metal or plastic, and while Grimer and Muck could eventually break them down, it's going to take a while, meaning you'll just end up cleaning it out of their enclosure anyway. You can, however, throw in rotting organic material. Old veggies and fruit, moldy leftovers, bread or cheese that went bad, all of these things will easily get digested by a Grimer evolution. In reality, if they weren't so toxic themselves, these guys would be amazing garbage disposals. You want to keep adding all this stuff into the water barrel until you nearly fill it. Make sure to stir it at least once a day, as you don't want anything to settle and separate. And then it's time for feeding. You'll need a container that you can fill with the food, a funnel for the tube on top of the enclosure, and at least a good set of rubber gloves that go up to your elbows, if not more protection. I suggest you also get some sort of eye and nose protection in the case of splashing. The act of feeding them is pretty simple at least. Just dunk the container in the barrel to fill it, then walk over, put the funnel in the top of the tube, and carefully pour the food down the funnel and into the tube. As for how much to use, it's pretty simple. Since they're the same weight, Muck only needs a bit more food than Grimer to sustain its larger body and give it the energy to move that larger body. Grimer should get about 1 gallon of the food per day, and increase that up to 1.5 gallons from Muck. The last thing that we should talk about for the care of these guys is cleaning the enclosure. Like I said, if you let these guys just build up slime and ooze in the enclosure, you're gonna end up having more than one of these Pokemon. For those of us that don't want an entire colony of these guys, you'll have to regularly clean out the enclosure. The first thing you're going to need is hazmat gear. I'm talking full skin coverings, mask, air filters, thick gloves, the whole works. You're going to at least be sticking your whole upper body into the enclosure to clean it, so too much protection isn't really a thing here. You'll also need a scrubber, towels, a bucket, and some heavy chemicals, which is another reason you should be wearing some hazmat protection. The chemicals you're going to need for this are strong, and can easily cause damage to you in such a confined space. And then from there, it's pretty much standard. Put the Pokemon in their ball, open up the enclosure, and start scrubbing away with those chemicals. Your goal in all this is to break up the budding bacteria colonies and the ooze itself that is all over the enclosure, no doubt. Meaning you might have to put some effort into it, as the slime can be very tough to break up. Think of it like you're trying to break up congealed grease after you just got done cooking. Then, once everything is nice and scrubbed and broken up, you use the towels to wipe it all up. Rinse and repeat until you don't see a trace of the slime left. And then, it's important that you rinse out the enclosure with just regular water. If you leave the chemicals on the wall, then they could have a negative effect on your Pokemon's health, considering those chemicals are made to break down things like Grimer and Muck's bodies. Once everything is rinsed and dry, close up the enclosure again and put your Grimer evolution back in. Simple, but time-consuming, and possibly dangerous if you aren't careful about it. Also, at the end of this, you may want to throw those towels out that you used. I don't think you want them in your clothes washer, and they might not be in good shape afterwards anyway. Don't forget that you'll also have to scrub the feeding tube as well. Your Pokemon shouldn't be able to reach it, but you are dumping its gross food through it, so it's gonna get pretty nasty pretty quick. In the end, you're probably gonna have to do this at least once a week, maybe more depending on how active your Pokemon is, how big you decide to make the enclosure, and if you have a Muck or a Grimer. Oh, and don't forget to store the chemicals in a safe place like a high shelf or a locked cabinet. The last thing you want is for another Pokemon or a kid to get into them. Cost. The food is probably going to be your cheapest expense. The best solution I can think for it is if you happen to know any mechanic shops around you. All the stuff from cars like old oil, grease, and fuel can easily be mixed into your Grimer Evolution's food. And since it's all stuff that they'll either be throwing away or swept off the floor, you can usually get it from them for pretty cheap. In all, I don't see the food being more than a moderate expense per month. The Pokemon, though, is hard to gauge, mostly because there isn't a market for these guys. Major places that use them for industrial waste cleanup have enough that they don't need to get any, and can spawn as many as they need. And the collectors that have them can really charge anything they want. But based on their enclosure setup and how dangerous caring for these Pokemon can be, I'm going to say that you probably won't be getting one for any less than the high category. Which brings us to the enclosure. Because of the materials needed in its construction, as well as the exacting way that the enclosure needs to be put together, I would say that putting it together won't be any less than the high category. Especially if you do as I and any other normal person recommends, and you use the best grade material that you can find. Remember, you're trying to keep a living toxin spill from getting out and causing havoc on the surrounding ecosystem, so I would say the expense is worth it. Conclusion. If it weren't for the fact that they're so toxic themselves, then these guys could be great. I mean, they eat trash and waste and anything else polluting the environment. They could solve all pollution issues if they didn't cause them themselves. But as it stands, these guys are some of the most noxious Pokemon out there, maybe only rivaled by the coughing line. So for the average person, I can't recommend that they get them. Sure, their care is easy, mostly because you don't interact with them, but there's still a major chance that you could get poisoned by these guys by accident. I mean, even their food and the chemicals you have to use to clean their enclosure are not good for your health if you come into direct contact with them. For that reason, I just can't recommend that these guys be taking care of anyone that isn't an expert in caring for poison types. But if that is you, then I would say that these guys could very easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the mollusk Pokemon Shelder and its evolution Cloyster. Have a wonderful night, everyone.